plans with respect to the future of that facility. I'm sure, Mr. Speaker, if they are developed at some point, they may be brought forward for my consideration, but they have not at this time.
The honourable member for Halifax Needham on your first supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, mental health specialists are saying that 2 aging buildings at that site, both Purdy and Simpson, will surely close fairly shortly, and services will be moved off-site and others will be shut down. Now, Mr. Speaker, these 2 buildings provide valuable services, well over 50 acute care mental health beds. Dr. Ross, the head of the QE2 emergency department, has told us that they often have to send psychiatric patients to other health districts because there simply aren't enough beds in this region. So shutting down services and beds doesn't make sense. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister of Health is, when the Purdy and Simpson buildings are torn down, decommissioned, as the Capital Health District has confirmed will be done, where are the patients and services and staff presently housed in those buildings going to go?
Good question.
The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, what I will undertake to do for the honourable member is provide the details with respect to that matter. But I can say, Mr. Speaker, that the issue of delivery of care is one that is centered around not just facilities, but the individuals and everyone that is involved in the delivery of that care. And the business planning process is one which will ensure that that care is carried forward and continues to be given to the citizens of this province.
The member for Halifax Needham on your final supplementary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, I couldn't agree more with the minister with respect to the need for better planning and better programs for mental health consumers. But, Mr. Speaker, the Nova Scotia hospital location, as we know, on the harbour, on the Dartmouth side of the harbour, with expansive grounds, is a very beautiful location, and in fact that location was chosen 150 years ago for the therapeutic value of the expansive grounds on the hospital, on the harbour. Mr. Speaker, I want to ask the minister if his department will consider establishing smaller residential treatment programs like exist in other jurisdictions in that location as they look at replacing those older buildings.
Minister of Health.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And the Department of Health is, of course, open to discussions with the District Health Authority relative to the provision of services, and we would work with them relative to any plans that they bring forward, and I'm sure that they're aware of the suggestions made by the honourable member. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Halifax Atlantic.
Mr. Speaker, my question is for the Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations. Erin Cove is a fishing village in my constituency, like others, settled more than 200 years ago, and many of the older houses there still draw their water from wells in this rocky soil. In the last 30 years, however, hundreds of new homes have been built in the Erin Cove area, and many of them are served by community wells that don't yield enough water for their needs. Those new wells have failed, but so have the old ones, and the residents of the older houses now have to buy bottled water for themselves. And during the same 30 years, they've been paying wastewater charges as if they had city water. Mr. Minister, how is this fair?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Mr. Speaker, I would say that's a question probably more directly put towards the Halifax Regional Municipality, but I'll say this. The province of Nova Scotia has contributed towards sewer and water projects here in Nova Scotia, over $150 million over the past number of years, and we will continue to do so through the Canada-Nova Scotia Infrastructure Works programs and all other programs that come forward.
Now, member for Halifax Atlantic on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, when the province of Nova Scotia deeded the sewer to the then city of Halifax, It was on condition that only a limited number of houses should be hooked into it, and that limit has been long exceeded. The water table is in deep trouble there, and the province has washed its hands of it. The kind of water that you wash your hands in, though, that the province has washed its hands in, is nothing you'd want to drink. And a lot of people who bought new houses in Herring Cove in the 80s, when it was province, were told that they had city water. And they were shocked to discover that actually their water came from a group of community wells with dangerously high levels of lead. One might argue, and there's a very good argument, even lethal. These wells, though, often have so little water, and that's lucky, that they have to be filled by tanker trucks sent by the Halifax Water Commission. Why has your department allowed this community to fall through the cracks between the city and the province?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Again, as I indicated earlier, the municipality is responsible for the provision of water and sewer. We will work with municipalities as they bring forward projects under the Canada-Nova Scotia Infrastructure Program. I'll indicate to the member opposite that there are many communities that are in similar circumstances that require safe sewer and water provided to their front door, and we will do whatever we can with the resources that we have.
The Honourable Member of Halifax Atlantic on your final supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, this whole province is rocky, and Herring Cove is not the only community this is happening in. The water table lies in those small pockets, and Fall River and Marion Bridge and Hammonds Plains and Beaver Bank and probably some others are losing their wells. But it's the people who lived there before who bear the huge costs of replacing their water as new development encroaches on them. Mr. Minister, when will your government empower municipalities to require full hydrogeological assessments before approving substantial new development?
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's a very good question. It's one that Halifax Regional Municipality has brought to our attention over the past number of months. It's something that we're taking into consideration, and we'll examine the impact of that. One of the things that we want to make sure we do, Mr. Speaker, however, is not provide some false hopes for people who expect that hydrological study will provide them water for the rest of their day. We also want to ensure that we don't raise the value of lots so much that it becomes unaffordable for people who want to build a home. So, Mr. Speaker, we're considering all of these things, and as we move forward and work forward with our analysis, we'll bring forward legislation if it's appropriate.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Citadel.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question is again for the Premier. The Premier is responsible for the financial, health, and social well-being of the people of this province. In a letter that was tabled by the Leader of the Opposition yesterday, I'd like to quote from page 5. It says, "The number of men, women, and children who suffer moderate to severe financial, health, and social problems as a direct result of problem gambling in Nova Scotia is 120,000. My question for the Premier is simple. Why do we need VLTs?
The Premier.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And that question has been asked for a long time. It was certainly asked in this province long before the government made the decision to regulate gambling, because we had VLTs in our province well before we had regulated gambling. But I think it is a very serious issue. It is an issue that I fully appreciate why the member opposite would have a concern, but that's why there's a discussion paper. I believe that gambling should be regulated, and I believe that as a result of the discussion paper, we'll regulate it better.
Now, member for Halifax Citadel on your first supplementary.
Mr. Speaker, my question was not whether or not we can regulate it better. It is, what is the purpose of VLTs, Mr. Premier?
The Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I wish I had an answer for the question, Mr. Speaker, because I don't. But the point is, we have VLTs, and we had VLTs before we had regulated gambling. And if we stop regulated gambling, we'll still have VLTs. Those are the simple facts, Mr. Speaker. I wish it were otherwise.
Now, member for Halifax Citadel on your final supplementary.
His last words, Mr. Speaker, were, "I wish it was otherwise." This is the Premier of Nova Scotia saying he wishes it was otherwise, and there are tens of thousands of Nova Scotians who share that view. Will you convey to Nova Scotians a real sign of leadership, the kind of leadership you showed 6 years ago, and ban VLTs in Nova Scotia?
The Honourable the Premier.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Obviously, we have a fundamental difference of opinion and policy. There will be VLTs whether or not we ban them or not. History has certainly proven that. And I believe, and I guess I have a fundamental difference of opinion here with the member opposite, I believe if we are to have VLTs, they must be regulated. I believe that government has a responsibility to regulate well. That's why we have the discussion paper.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Nova.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my question through you is for the Minister of Environment and Labour. During question period last spring, I raised the issue of coal dust continuing to blanket my community. Having met with the Minister of Environment and Labour, along with members of my community, we were assured that this coal dust problem would be brought under control. We were told that the proper mechanisms were in place to deal with this. Well, Mr. Speaker, today nothing has happened. The coal dust problem is still under control, still out of control, and is in fact as bad as ever. Over the past several weeks, I've been in contact with residents who have enough of this black dust everywhere they turn. So I'd like to ask the Minister, why is he not living up to his word to fix the problem?
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and that the member opposite is perfectly correct. That did come up before. I did make a trip down and we toured the sites. We took a look at the provisions that were in place to prevent the coal dust from blowing over the residents and the houses, because it's certainly something that we wanted to avoid and something we thought should be controlled. Unfortunately, there has been another mishap, and that is being investigated at this point in time, and I'm very hopeful that the investigation will come up with a solution to the problem.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Nova on your first supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, swimming pools, homes, backyards, children's swing sets are covered with coal dust. Mr. Speaker, yet no one wants to take responsibility for this ongoing problem. For the Minister's information, I will table copies of photographs took earlier this month which clearly show clouds of dust blowing across my community. The problem is not restricted to the outdoors, Mr. Speaker. I would like to table a cloth coated with coal dust from inside one of my constituency's homes. Mr. Speaker, how much of this environmental abuse does my community have to take?
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, we certainly do know the source of this problem. We are carrying on with our investigation. We will look to find a solution.
The Honourable Member for Cape Breton Nova on your final supplementary.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Well, Mr. Speaker, we all know how bad the economic situation is in Cape Breton. Despite this, people in my community were starting to reinvest, and they don't need this. The community is finally turning the corner to better times, and this will blanket their enthusiasm the same way coal dust blankets their community. What will it take for your government to treat the residents of my community with respect and deal with this ongoing nightmare?
Order, please, just for allow the Honourable Minister to answer. I just want to remind members about bringing props into the House, but even more than that, about ones that may be environmentally questionable. Now, Minister of Environment and Labour. Minister of Environment and Labour.
Table the cloth, I guess. Mr. Speaker, we certainly do respect those residents. I appreciate what they're going through. I have made a visit down there. We certainly want to do everything we can to ensure that this doesn't happen again, and we will take the appropriate measures. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Environment and Labour in his role as the Minister responsible for the Pension Benefits Act. At present, the Pension Benefits Act provides for what are known as grow-in benefits. Grow-in benefits are extremely costly for employers and employees. Even though they are rarely, if ever, paid, these provisions create tremendous cost to pension plans. Grow-in pension benefits are causing real and financial hardship for public sector organizations that are being forced to provide for these benefits. which mean, in fact, they have to put money aside to protect against a non-existent risk that they will cease to exist. The UNSM and the HRM have both expressed concerns about this, as have universities in the province. Mr. Speaker, my question to the Minister is the Minister aware of the pressing need to address this issue?
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I certainly have had a great deal of correspondence since the last sitting of the House on this issue, and we have staff investigating, reviewing the information, and looking at what our future plans might be.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park on your first supplementary.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, the HRM, as a case in point, is facing a financial crisis as a result of these provisions. If the grow-in benefits requirement is not eliminated now, they will have to find $14 million in the coming year to cover this unnecessary cost. That is, the municipality will have to take as much as they budget for the roads of this municipality in a single year and set it aside for really to cover a risk that does not exist. If government does not respond, this will cost HRM taxpayers dearly through either higher property taxes or lower services. Mr. Speaker, my question for the Minister is, will the Minister commit to address this issue in the current session of the House in order to respond to the serious financial concerns of HRM and others?
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour.
Mr. Speaker, I think it's pertinent to point out that in the Financial Measures Act in the spring, we had this provision in, and because we didn't have cooperation within the House, it didn't go through at that point in time.
The Honourable Member for Halifax Clayton Park, you have about 15 seconds.
Mr. Speaker, we like to look forward in this instance, and I believe the issue is better understood and should be addressed. Will the Minister address it this session?
The Honourable Minister of Environment and Labour, you have about 2 seconds. Actually, one, too late. The order, please. The Honourable question, time for a lot of question period has expired. The Honourable Minister of Agriculture on introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I think I'll do this properly instead of in question period. I'd like to introduce and ask them to rise the Honourable David Alward from New Brunswick, who is the Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries and Aquaculture. Also, the Honourable Kevin McAdam, who is from Prince Edward Island, also the Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries.
Certainly welcome. Special guest of the gallery today, and hope they've enjoyed the proceedings. The Honourable Minister of Education on introduction.
Thank you, Speaker, and I rise on a point of order and I guess really an apology. In response to a question from the member from Timberley Prospect, he indicated the piece of paper had been circulated at 2 o'clock. It was not. I knew better. It was at 3. I apologize.
The Honourable Member for Annapolis on introduction.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would like to draw the attention of the host to the West Gallery. I can't trump 2 ministers, but I would like to introduce my constituency assistant, Pam Van Rostel. Pam and her husband Jim own a dairy farm, and I'm sure if the minister needs any help solving the BSE crisis, she'd be more than willing to. I'll loan her to you for the afternoon. How's that? But I would ask the host to give Pam a warm welcome.
The Honourable House Leader for the Official Opposition on Opposition Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Maybe we can I'm just looking at the time. Maybe we can adjust everything 1 minute down. So everything will start at 4:17. We'll adjust 1 minute down. And the first bill we're calling is Bill number 104, Amendments to the Emergency Measures Act.
Bill number 104, the Honourable Member for Halifax Shabakto.
Well, Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. The motion will be for second reading of Bill 104. Let me begin by setting the context for the introduction of this bill. You will know that it deals, of course, with matters having to do with the Emergency Measures Organization. Bill 104 is a proposal to amend the existing Emergency Measures Act. Today being the anniversary of the damage to Nova Scotia in last year's Hurricane Juan, everyone in this chamber is, of course, today particularly acutely aware of what it is that this province suffered through that hurricane last year. All of us, I think, were present in the province at the time, and indeed all of us were personally affected, I think, or certainly are aware of the extent of the effects on people in our differing constituencies. The hurricane hit Nova Scotia overnight and passed in a fairly wide path, across the central part of the province. The damage was extensive. It's been estimated to have been on the order of about $100 million of damage in Nova Scotia. Now, of course, this is not the only extreme weather event that Nova Scotians have suffered in the last year. We had a particularly severe winter storm, which was quickly dubbed White Juan this past winter. Now, the hard fact is that there is the prospect of very similar severe weather events coming to Nova Scotia in the future. So we have to be prepared, we have to turn our minds to it. One of the effects of global climate change will simply be this kind of change in weather affecting us here in the Maritimes. We are not used to having hurricanes here. It's not unknown in the past, we have had them, but they have often been separated by very many years, sometimes by decades, before they've hit Nova Scotia with any severe force. That is, before they've actually hit the land with any severe force. Mariners will be much more familiar with the effects of hurricanes on our offshore. But onshore, we have to turn our minds to this, and therefore we have to be prepared to deal with this in an organized way. Now, the EMO, a provincial organization, is the lead organization. And yet, of course, it works through many of the municipalities. We know that many of the municipalities are looked to deliver the services on the ground during an emergency, or to be part of the coordinated efforts, to be an important part of the coordination of efforts. We also know that, unfortunately, a number of our municipalities, some 16 of them, in the last time a survey was done by the Emergency Measures Organization, can only be rated fair or poor in their overall preparedness to deal with a major emergency. Now, the Minister has told us that some improvements have been accomplished since that last survey was done. Well, that's fine. And it's good, of course, that there be advances. And yet, there are two other categories of preparedness, excellent and good, and it's certainly the case, given the pressure of our experience in what we have found in the extreme weather events in this last year, that we should move as rapidly as possible to the situation when every one of our municipalities can be characterized in their preparedness as excellent or good. To continue to have some municipalities in the category of poor or fair simply is not acceptable. Now, there is one other fact that I think we have to turn our minds to in understanding the context for this legislation, and this is that there has never been any full public review of how it is that this province encountered and dealt with Hurricane Juan. Calling for a public review is something that we did early, and we've said it regularly since that time. The idea of a public review is that it should look at all aspects of how it is that we dealt with the hurricane. It should look at the advance warnings that were given and when they were given. It should look at interaction with Environment Canada's weather forecasting system and personnel by EMO. It should look at our general preparedness prior to Juan. It should look at the extent of the damage. It should look at how it was that cleanup efforts were undertaken. It should look at Nova Scotia Power and the provision of electrical services. It should look at compensation. Now, I'm not saying that there's never been any kind of a look after Hurricane Juan at different aspects of this. Indeed, as we know, the matter of the preparedness of Nova Scotia Power Inc. was referred to the Utility and Review Board, and they did a focused examination with some criticism, I have to say, in their findings of how Nova Scotia Power dealt with its aspect of Hurricane Juan. And I know that internally, in the Minister's own department, they did an examination of some parts of how they dealt with the hurricane. What I'm saying is that from start to finish, there's a whole array of questions that have not yet been publicly looked at. Now, I know that since I've been the one making the suggestion for full public examination of all aspects of this, that the minister has been resistant to it, and for whatever reason, and unfortunately, perhaps the situation is that this will never take place. Perhaps I have to accept that, but I still think it's desirable. All of this, Mr. Speaker, is part of the context for the introduction of our bill. But before I get to the content of it, I also want to remind members in this House of what the effects actually were, because we have to remember what exactly it is that this actually meant on the ground to people in their day-to-day lives. What it meant is that a huge number of trees were knocked down, and part of the consequences of that was damage to housing, damage to power lines, damage to vehicles, and indeed loss of life. Now, that was really one of the major things that struck everyone when we woke up the next morning. Thank heavens, it was a beautiful sunny day. I hope everyone remembers this. And Nova Scotians were out in their thousands to look with a feeling of awe at the damage that had been done overnight. And people were amazed. People were amazed to see enormous trees toppled. People were amazed to see the extent of the damage. But how fortunate we were that it was good weather. How fortunate we were that there weren't continuing rainstorms. How fortunate we were that it occurred in the beauty of our autumn rather than in the depths of winter. How different it might have been, how much worse it would have been. Now, let's remember that those downed power lines, whether they came down through being toppled by trees or their branches, or simply came down on their own, resulted in thousands of Nova Scotians being without electrical power, and it took weeks for that power to be fully restored to people around the province. And we have to remind ourselves what that means to be without electricity. We have built our lives around having access to energy in that form. Without electricity, no lights. Without electricity, no elevators. Without electricity, no refrigerators. For many people, without electricity, no stoves, no kettles. So this indeed makes an important impact on people's lives, and it did make an important impact on people's lives. It wasn't a question of being inconvenienced. It was a question for some people of really being put at risk. And as I say, we were fortunate that it occurred during a time of year that the snow and ice were not on the ground. It was beautiful weather that followed the time after the arrival of Hurricane Juan and its damage. So cleanup efforts could proceed apace, and even then it took weeks. Now, the ones who were, of course, worst affected were our seniors and those who, for other reasons, because of physical difficulties, primarily, were the most vulnerable. So what that meant was, typically for people who are in situations of physical difficulty, many of them were stranded in their homes. But even where that was the case, they were probably more fortunate than those who were stranded in apartment buildings. In those apartment buildings, in many of them, the elevators had ceased to work. They were stuck. And unless they had a network of neighbors or friends who were checking in on them, then they were exposed, they were in danger. Now, I have to say that the arrival of Hurricane Juan was the occasion for many individuals and for many service organizations and for many spontaneous groupings of people to come forward and do wonderful things in their communities. I know in my own constituency, there were examples of people reaching out to their neighbors, to people they might not necessarily have known even, and making food available, checking in on them, looking after them. This is terrific. And for the most part, many elderly people and many people who are in positions of physical disabilities will have a network of connections, family or friends or some service organization where people were going to look after them, check in on them, see how they are. This is as it should be. And yet, there are some people who simply don't have that. And there are some people who are in need of a support but may not necessarily be aware of it or have necessarily been able to organize their lives in a way that would allow those supports to come forward in time of emergency. Indeed, sometimes informal supports cannot operate in times of emergency. Sometimes relatives live quite some distance away. What is needed is some kind of organized form of preparedness so that if people are in that position, they can voluntarily put themselves on a list with EMO so that EMO will know who is out there in an emergency and judge whether they have to be checked in on. And that's what Bill 104 is all about. Bill 104 says this is a little bit of a gap in our legislation. It's a little bit of a gap in our procedures. And you know what? It might not even have been necessary to bring forward a bill to do this if, in fact, this had been part of what it is that the government had said it was prepared to do. Now, our bill actually goes a little bit farther, and it talks about how appropriate it would be for EMO, and in fact requires EMO, to have available not just this list of vulnerable or elderly persons who might require assistance during an emergency, but to then go on and require that all senior citizens buildings must either have a generator available as a backup to generate electricity or some form of adequate plan in order to make sure that something is available for people. It wouldn't have to be that the whole electricity in that building had to be made to work. One room would be adequate. Solar panels might be adequate, but something has to be put in place in order to do that, and there have to be plans made by EMO. That's the context, that was the effects we should remember, and that's what this bill is all about. And Mr. Speaker, I look forward to hearing the comments of other members in this debate. Thank you very much.
The Honourable Minister responsible for the Emergency Measures Organization.
To rise this afternoon to speak about the Emergency Measure Organization here in Nova Scotia and all its partners. Mr. Speaker, there's a couple of things I really do want to note, and certainly this being the anniversary of Hurricane 1, the day after the hurricane, when Nova Scotians awoke to see the devastation in our capital city here and the destruction throughout Hants, Colchester, and Pictou County, and particularly in Truro and into Pictou before it left the province. It certainly was an eye-opener for all Nova Scotians, and it reminded everyone involved in emergency preparedness, as well as all citizens, that we have to be prepared for natural disasters of any kind. But it highlighted also, I think, the general awareness of the public to being prepared. And the events of that morning, there was certainly miles and kilometers of down power lines, utility poles, communications was disrupted, massive outages of power, and certainly when you looked at the number of trees and coming down in the force of the hurricane, some of the storm surge damage around the entire basin here in the waterfront, it gave everyone pause to thought about the power of Mother Nature. And I think, Mr. Speaker, it also is an ideal opportunity to highlight three things. The first thing, Mr. Speaker, that it highlights is that adequate warning and adequate preparedness by the citizens of the province of Nova Scotia, and it gives us a benchmark to analyze that against. The second thing, Mr. Speaker, is the actual occurrence itself, how emergency organizations and individual citizens responded. And fourthly, the ensuing cleanup and trying to get life back to normal. And Mr. Speaker, it was certainly gratifying as Minister responsible as we moved toward that fateful Monday, and at 1:30 a.m. when the center of the storm hit, that Thursday and Friday and Saturday I was dealing with directors of VMO. They were talking to area coordinators, municipalities, to ensure that the core of the EMO response at the municipal and provincial level was ready, that volunteer and organizations such as search and rescue and local fire departments as well as the Red Cross were online, and that the media was being advised to warn Nova Scotians. It also highlights that individual Nova Scotians, as we did in the press release with the Red Cross, with their new awareness initiative yesterday, I participated in, along with Honourable Minister David Morris, the need to keep citizens aware of their individual responsibilities in regard to a safe place, in regard to portable water, and being able to have enough food and critical supplies, blankets, candles, all those things to last from 48 to 72 hours. When we move into the actual occurrence of the event, it's the general public being aware that the event is happening and in progress, and to be in the safest place possible for themselves and their family. And certainly, Mr. Speaker, one thing I'd really like to note is how fortunate we were indeed with Hurricane Juan. Sadly, there was loss of life, but in the main, Mr. Speaker, when you looked at when the storm came ashore at 1:30 on Monday a.m. in the morning, if you were designing a more fortunate time when people would be in the safest place in their homes, they were resting up from a weekend and preparing for work Monday morning, it was certainly in a fortunate circumstance because many people were in the right place. They were home, they were safe when the hurricane struck. The response afterwards, Mr. Speaker, was a phenomenal response. When you look at the kilometers of down power lines, the massive amount of trees and material that had to be moved to restore transportation, restore power and communications. The Army's response from the federal government was certainly appreciated. Certainly the response from power crews and our international and interprovincial agreements about power crews into Nova Scotia from the affected corridors. Enough cannot be said about the dedication of those professionals to ensure that power was restored as quickly as possible. And Mr. Speaker, in many cases in our large urban centers like Halifax and Truro, you were replacing street after street, brand new utility wire pole, the whole infrastructure. One thing I'd like to note is, Mr. Speaker, why it's important that municipalities, when they're putting in new subdivisions and areas, should look at underground utilities. The central core of downtown Halifax here was underground utilities, and they were up and running on Monday, and it shows the benefit of those utilities when the opportunity arises that they can be renewed and put in an urban setting, that you can protect them that much easier. And those ones in the core, they responded, were able to be hooked up quickly and respond. The department certainly was one with EMO and our coordination. It was wonderful to observe professionals going about their job, organizing, solving problems as they arose. And just to give you a little example, for that initial week, I personally attended their operational centers meeting each morning. 52 agencies, Mr. Speaker, were represented there. They were represented the federal government, the military, their disaster relief program. It represented all government departments in Nova Scotia, from natural resources protecting and keeping the trunk mobile radio system operating for emergency services, for our relief efforts, for our law enforcement, and for contact between fire departments and emergency people, as well as outside agencies and private businesses such as Alliant, such as Nova Scotia Power or Mira, as well as major volunteer organizations like the Red Cross. And once you move after the initial phase of into the cleanup and the assessment of major centers, then it's restoring services and making sure people receive the supplies, from food to portable water to blankets to other essentials of life. And certainly I do want to note the Department of Community Services, and especially their contracted partner in emergencies, the Canadian Red Cross. When you look at them being able to address the major needs of 30,000 people, the agency alone provided 5,000 meals and conducted 70 food drops in 45 different locations, just as an indication of how well coordinated that operational center is, and why the Senate Committee of Canada uses Nova Scotia as the #1 province in emergency preparedness, in how prepared they are, but how good their system is set up, and recommend it indeed, Mr. Speaker, as the model for any province or jurisdiction in Canada. The other thing I'd like to highlight is how Nova Scotians individually and businesses respond to a disaster, whether it was the Home Builders Association or many other corporate entities. They were there with cash, with supplies, with foodstuffs to support agencies like the food bank here, run by Diane Swinimer, her efficiency, support the Red Cross, right through, Mr. Speaker, to individual Nova Scotians, from Boy Scouts troops helping to remove trees from houses in their neighborhood. That's how coordinated it was, and that's how important it was, neighbors supporting neighbors, and the greater sense of community that does arise from that citizens do arise individually to the occasions, and so does business. The other thing, when you analyze the system, I think that is a good benchmark for EMO and for us, was certainly, we had another occurrence in February known as White Wand. It was a storm, extremely intense storm system that was closing or blocking roads in as short as 20 minutes in this province, Mr. Speaker. With the use of the meteorology service, which is critical, and modeling, as well as what was starting to happen in the southern end of the province, we invoked, with officials in discussion, I invoked a state of emergency so that we could use our transportation officials, our law enforcement people, to get the main arterial roads in this province closed before the storm came. Not only was it important as a safety factor for individuals' safety during the event, so they would not be stranded and thus protect their health or run the risk of having an accident before they were stuck in those snowdrifts, but it aided the cleanup. Instead of having to remove thousands of cars from snowdrifts, the plowing crews, when it cleared, are able to move forward and clean out the streets and the roads and the main arterial centers. And certainly here in Halifax, it was important to aid the city and other urban areas. Halifax doesn't normally get a lot of snow, and they have not maintained heavy equipment over the last number of years. And so extra equipment that we could bring in from other jurisdictions under agreement and divert transportation and public works, snow plows and equipment. But more importantly, in the effort to clean the city out and get it moving, state of emergency allows the suspension of private contracts, so that we had major construction or industrial suppliers here in the metro industry providing hundreds of pieces of equipment so that we could get that snow moved quickly as possible within the city, get a hole through so that fire, ambulance, essential services could be restored to neighborhoods in case there was a medical emergency. Again, the citizens responded looking out for their neighbors, making sure that people were contracted on their streets or in apartment buildings, and the system performed well. And in a matter of 3 or 4 days, we were well on our way back to a state of normalcy, even though we had to wade some pretty major drifts at some spots until the snow could be completely cleared in major urban centers. But the core, Mr. Speaker and fellow members of the House, for emergency measureness is ensuring that we continually upgrade and work on the system through cooperation. The system of EMO is a coordinated office. It's not an office that is designed to employ large numbers of people. It's a system that's designed to work closely with every municipal unit in this province and with the federal government and with voluntary organizations. And Mr. Speaker, the goal of all that cooperation is to ensure that the people closest to, whether it's a senior's home, an emergency shelter, an apartment building, are the ones that have a detailed plan that we help them with. We help them to find the resources for equipment such as generators or other things that would be deemed essential in a time of emergency, so that there are people in every community that can respond if the unfortunate circumstances of a natural disaster or a man-made disaster occur. And certainly I believe those issues of heightened awareness of what you need as an individual to help protect yourself and your family. The response to White Swan was very elevated in the general public, and they knew what they had to do. They were prepared. No one likes to put up with the inconvenience of losing their power or communication or transportation system down. But when you have a true emergency, Mr. Speaker, what happens in those situations, every one of those systems are partially or totally disrupted. We've seen that in Hurricane Juan, right here in the city and other areas like Truro, as well as the countryside. We've seen it with White Swan. The important thing is we had the people in place to respond quickly and to satisfy the essential needs of Nova Scotians during that time of distress. And I want to thank all Nova Scotians for their response and help of the people of this province. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The honourable member for Halifax Citadel.
Mr. Speaker, my comments through you will be to the Honourable Minister in relation to this matter in many respects, because I think that if the Minister were to read the legislation, he would see that there is some real value in what's being proposed by the NDP in these circumstances. Now, I run the risk of raising the memory of me hollering about the need for us to have the Tasty Treat truck going around to alert seniors and vulnerable Nova Scotians in the time of Juan, to tell people that there is a problem out there. But in the spirit of this, I think that the NDP is, I think, advancing an idea that requires some support. My opportunity to advance these ideas, or at least to comment on this, will relate to changes that might happen to potentially improve this piece of legislation. You'll recall, Mr. Speaker, back when Hurricane Juan happened, the problems of the seniors in Sir John Thompson Centre. At that time, for 3 days, seniors in that building were without power, without the kinds of resources that they need to function on a day-to-day basis. Fortunately, as a result of the efforts of many folks, and this matter was raised in the House by our caucus,
ultimately some satisfaction was brought to that troubling situation. But I think we learned great lessons from the experience of Hurricane Juan, and the greatest is that we need to be better prepared. In a minority government, good ideas deserve and should receive the support that all sensible people can apply to those. And in this situation, I would urge upon the government consideration of the NDP proposals. They are ones that we support the spirit of, and with some changes to the legislation, I think we can find ourselves in a situation where legislation that's being put forward by one of the parties in opposition ultimately is accepted and it moves forward, and in some circumstances, given the potential gravity of this piece of legislation, could save lives. Specifically, I would say that the matter of providing adequate resources for this piece of legislation is a matter that the government should turn its mind to. This obviously has significant cost implications in terms of first developing the list and then providing for the implementation of it if the worst happened and we had to go forward with that. If I could refer to some of the specific clauses that are contained in this legislation. First, with respect to 8A sub A, if I could, in these circumstances, just comment briefly. The list that is being created, it should be clear, should be a confidential list and not one that would be distributed widely. It should be obviously available to those who are affected by the implementation of its principle, but the list itself should be kept confidential. In the first sub-paragraph where there is the mention of making a list of vulnerable or elderly person. I'm not sure whether that is in the legal drafting terms conjunctive or disjunctive, and I think some attention should be given to whether or not the or should be an and in those circumstances. With respect to Clause B, that requires that all senior citizens buildings must either have a generator or an adequate plan to guarantee the provision of power, I would suggest that this clause, if it were properly phrased, could go beyond just seniors' residents and include homes with vulnerable people more generally. And there clearly are homes that have people in them who would have some difficulty managing for themselves, but who are not seniors. And if that provision were, that amendment were provided to this piece of legislation, I would suggest, Mr. Speaker, that again it would be strengthened. With respect to Clause C, which provides for the making of plans for distribution of meals during an emergency, it does, when one looks at the making plans for distributing meals, I think it's important to recognize that making meals costs money. And if this is to be a serious piece of legislation that would be effectively implemented by the government down the road, then there needs to be a fund set aside or an identified source of income to ensure that the meals in fact could be fed. We don't want the seniors receiving empty plates as a result of this. All the best laid plans will be for naught if there's not the food on the table. Secondly, with respect to this subparagraph, I think that the plans should extend not just to the provision of meals, but to the provision of meals and shelter. That's contemplated in subsection D, and I appreciate that if the only problem is power, then presumably it won't be a power problem because there's generators that will provide power independently, but there is the possibility in the event of an emergency that power cannot be put back into a home as a result of structural damage or something more significant happening at a later date. So the provision for shelter, I think, would be an enhancement to paragraph C. Finally, with respect to subparagraph D, it's important to remember that one's participation in this type of an exercise as a senior or vulnerable person is entirely discretionary. We can't oblige people unless they are in need of protection in the classic sense of it that's written into our legislation. We can't compel people to eat one's meals or to come to a shelter place that they choose not to be part of. And again, I think it's important to set that out in that paragraph.
With respect to the definitions, I'm not aware of elderly and vulnerable persons being defined terms under the Emergency Measures Act, and those are fairly broad terms, and if this legislation were to be enhanced again, I think that providing some parameters around what those terms exactly mean, who is affected by this, would again strengthen the legislation in general. Mr. Speaker, I know that it's the practice of members of this House to speak for their allotted 15 minutes when it comes to these opportunities, but when positive ideas come forward, subject to the suggested amendments that I have made, there's really very little to add. We're on to something that requires the attention of the government and the minister responsible for emergency measures. I would urge the government to pay close attention to this as a step forward. I would invite the New Democrats to perhaps comment on some of the suggestions that have been made, and certainly I would be willing to join with any all-party exercise to find a piece of legislation that ultimately provides the kind of protection to seniors and elderly that that Nova Scotians deserve. This would be the best example of how these three parties make minority government work ultimately in the best interests of all Nova Scotians. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Those are my comments.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, and it certainly is a pleasure to have the opportunity to respond on Bill number 104. Of course, this is a bill that I introduced earlier, and the Speaker may know that in addition to introducing it, I was joined by representatives from the Seniors and Pensioners organization, along with an individual from the League for Equal Opportunities, both groups who were very much interested in the content of the bill because they had lived through the experiences associated with Juan and with White Juan. But what really amazed me in the course of the questioning that took place during that press conference was the fact that although we as individuals identify those two events because they had a profound effect on our particular constituents or our area of the province, these people had all kinds of other events in mind that they knew about. Because, of course, there have been other significant events that have closed down sections of the province or communities for a particular period of time. And in fact, they might well be, very, very local, very, very confined to, I suppose we could call it a microclimate or, just the fact that it's a particular geographic part of the province. And the one that Mary Fleck was referring to when she was there happened to happen in Inverness County and in the area that she was from. And she talked about the ice storm back in 1998 and the way in which, or 1999, I guess it was, and happened to talk about the effect that had on seniors in her area who I think they called her and said at one point in time that they had been without power for a considerable period of time. They had no heat. And they had not been checked on. They were, I understood one person, I think she said had MS, her husband had Parkinson's, and here they were huddled under a blanket trying to keep warm. Now, I heard the former leader of the third party, the member for Halifax Citadel, talking about the definition of vulnerable people. Well, obviously, I think in most people's minds, those people would fall into that category. But more important, Mr. Speaker, is the fact that there would be an opportunity for individuals to self-identify themselves to the EMO, to say, here I am, here are my circumstances, here are the difficulties that I have that make it important for me to be on this list. And not only should I be on the list, but the EMO should know that these are the kinds of things that the EMO must be ready to deal with. In other words, in my particular case, for example, if I were adding my name to the list, I'm not talking about me in particular, but a senior would say, I need to be able to have power in order to have oxygen. In fact, I might even need an oxygen supply, that if I'm not in an area where I can have easy access to that, that in itself might become a problem. So this bill is designed to allow the government to undertake a centralized list that would, and I think when most people think of a list, they simply think, of a numbered list of people with names, address, and perhaps a phone number or an email address or something. Well, it's not just that simple, Mr. Speaker. I mean, obviously the infrastructure in compiling that list is something that the government's going to have to consider, because first of all, the list is going to have to be able to be accessed from a distributed network. Right? It's no good if a list is in Halifax and a part of the organization that needs to know about it is in Cape Breton or in Yarmouth or wherever, and the very power that creates the problem for the vulnerable person is the problem for those people who need access to the distributed list. So, thinking through that whole piece is part of it. The other part of it is, over and above being a list, it would also be a database that would list the particulars for the individuals involved and the things that they needed in order to be able to have some semblance of security in what would be an emergent situation. So this is the point of the bill. And I'm not sure what view the minister takes of this, but I would hope that the view that the minister and the government members would take of this is as a bill that is designed to assist them. Because I believe, and I think quite legitimately, that the government is involved in the administration of this province in order to be able to provide the best possible service to its citizenry. If it's not, then what the heck are they doing here, Mr. Speaker? I assume that that's the case. And I hope that they assume that the reason why we would introduce this kind of a bill is to provide them with the opportunity to see that this is essentially a good program. And I couldn't help but, on the way home the other night, listening to CBC, be quite surprised to hear this debate being widened beyond the boundaries of this House. And certainly the host of the evening program was talking from a woman who I understand identified herself as being from East Dalhousie. Does that sound right? I think that's where she identified herself from being from. She talked about being trapped in her house during a snowstorm with her and her husband. And she told this very interesting story where she talked about the fact that as soon as the snowstorm took place, they said, well, the first thing they have to do is go out and start shoveling the snow, which the husband, I understand, did. But unfortunately, the first thing that happened to him was the winds that were whipping the snow around at the time happened to catch the shovel, which come back and hit him in the face and broke his nose, and I understood his eye socket. So he then was, of course, back in the house. Here they were, trapped in the house, and now one of the individuals who was going to be involved in extricating them from that situation, in addition, was injured. So they had found themselves in a heck of a predicament at that point. I understand that the individual essentially suffered through, went back out, and still, after a number of days, managed to shovel them out so they could get out. And you listen to that story and you think, wow, what an exceptional set of circumstances. Well, something, Mr. Speaker, I was surprised because it was not an exceptional set of circumstances. In fact, I had a very similar story with respect to a person who, although not in my riding, lived in very close proximity to my riding, who said, look, I live out in Cherrybrook. I have a house that's set well back from the road. I have hired a person who was supposed to come out and do the driveway clearing for me, but in Hurricane Juan, there was so much snow down that the equipment that this person owned couldn't deal with it. So they literally couldn't get assistance in plowing them out. So here they were, trapped in their house for an extended period of time, for many days. And at some point in time, Mr. Speaker, the water and the food and the fuel just runs out. And as self-sufficient and as hardy as these people are, they're seniors. And they simply need attention and assistance. And fortunately for these people, through my office and through some of their friends, there was some assistance rendered. But that's not, that's relying on the vagaries of friendship and charity and all those things, rather than having a plan from a government that says that we recognize that these particular people are vulnerable and therefore need to have the assistance of an organization that is specialized in identifying those risks. And and in the interesting thing, I think, on this is that in many cases it will be a phone call, because the MO will make the call and the individual at the other side of the line will say, no, I'm fine, I have no problem, or I've been assisted by my grandson or something. Many of those people will be fine. So it is really a list that is designed to make sure that the worst doesn't happen, that people don't fall through the cracks, that in the event that for whatever reason somebody is not able to access help, there will be a government agency there that will supply a minimum level of service to these individuals. And I couldn't help but be surprised to hear the minister responsible for the MO say, well, there are already lists. The Department of Health has a list, and the Department of Community Services has a list. Well, the reality is there are various lists around, but that's the problem, Mr. Speaker. That underlines the very problem, which is that it's not a centralized list. Instead, you have this kind of haphazard combinations of lists that some people may be on or may not be on. And for example, I brought to the attention of the House one individual who in fact was on the Nova Scotia Power vulnerable persons list, and throughout the Hurricane Juan situation never got a call, was never checked on, despite the fact that she had taken the opportunity to put herself on the list. So that's the kind of thing that we're trying to deal with. Obviously, there are very significant special situations where you have seniors' residences that have elevators. Some of those elevators are in very large buildings. The majority of those, of course, are in the HRM. If you are in a wheelchair and you're on the 8th floor and there's no power, you're going to have a heck of a hard time getting out of that building. So ensuring that there are reasonable backup generators that provide power to the elevator system is, I don't think, an unreasonable expectation that the seniors of this province would have. I don't think it's unreasonable for them to say, well, if we live in a seniors housing complex, why shouldn't there be at least a large enough generator to provide some emergency lighting, to provide that at least one room, a common area, would have some heat. There would be a place to be able to make a cup of tea, perhaps a hot cup of soup. They're not asking that the power supply to the entire residence be supplied by a generator. They're simply asking that it be acknowledged that in extreme circumstances, there has to be a minimum level of service provided. And that's what this bill is about. As I said, these are vulnerable people. They're in a circumstances not because of choice, but because of the infirmity of age or health problems or whatever, they have a special level of need that has to be filled. And it is not good enough for the government to simply say, well, phone your family. And as Mary Fleck pointed out, that, in many cases, the family simply can't respond. They don't have the wherewithal. I mean, they may not even live in the same community. In fact, the very event that puts these people at risk would be the same kind of event that would put the family members at risk if they were asked to attempt to reach their loved ones. They don't simply have the equipment to be able to do that. So, Mr. Speaker, this is a very, very common sense piece of legislation. It simply asks that those who identify themselves as vulnerable, if there's concern from the third party with respect to the definition of vulnerable, bring forward some kind of a suggestion. We'll be happy to have a look at it. I think the most important thing is that this legislation get passed, and so I'll take my seat so we can have a vote on it.
The Honourable Minister of Education, you have about 15 seconds.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to take a few minutes to speak to the NDP amendments to the Emergency Measures Act, and as members of the House know, that for some number of years I had the responsibility.
Time allotted for the debate on this bill has expired. The Honourable House Leader for the official opposition, please, on next order of business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm sorry I had to interrupt such a scintillating debate on behalf of the Minister of Education. But I would like to call resolution number 2247.
Resolution number 2247, the Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to have an opportunity to rise in my place and speak to a resolution, actually, that I brought into the House on the 23rd of September. And, Mr. Speaker, I'll just read the therefore be it resolved part of this resolution. Therefore be it resolved that this legislature show some leadership and act to amend the Residential Tenancies Act so that any landlord whose failure to maintain a rental property to minimum standards resulting in its closing will be required by law to assume financial responsibility for housing displaced tenants for the duration of the month in which a residential premises is ordered vacated and for an additional 30 days. Now, Mr. Speaker, this resolution arose out of a specific problem, but I want to speak to the broader issue of the problem that frequently occurs in some of our constituencies where there is substandard housing. And Mr. Speaker, if there was any issue I think that I could address here in the legislature on behalf of my constituents, it would be this issue of substandard housing, or to take the gloss off it, Mr. Speaker, the problem of slum housing. Mr. Speaker, as we all know, the vast majority of landlords in our province are responsible property owners who provide good quality residential housing for their tenants, and they fully meet the requirements of the law. But sadly, Mr. Speaker, not all landlords are like this, and there are a few bad apples. And I think in most constituencies, we can actually name some of the slum landlords who own properties in a given area. And certainly in my constituency, in Halifax Needham, which includes the inner city community, there are certainly some slum landlords that have operated there for many years, and this has been a source of great frustration and irritation for many of us who have been working and living in that community. And Mr. Speaker, if there's one thing we need to make clear here in this debate, these landlords are not providing a social service, as some of them like to claim when they talk about their situations. I see the Minister of Municipal Affairs nodding his head in agreement with me. They are not providing us social services, and they are not good Samaritans who are out there doing what nobody else will do. They make a ton of money off people who are living in poverty, people who are very vulnerable, generally people with mental illnesses, addictions, perhaps people with disabilities, people with criminal records who have come out of the jails and the prisons. And Mr. Speaker, it is long, long overdue that political representatives at all levels of government take some initiative to deal with this problem. Mr. Speaker, this legislature empowered the regional municipality to create bylaws to license rooming houses in this province. This is something that still essentially has not happened, and there's a real reluctance to take on this issue for a variety of reasons. And one of the reasons that this issue does not get taken on in terms of enforcement of bylaws is that when you shut rooming houses down, where do those people go? Those people go to the streets, is generally where they go. And they go to the streets because the Minister of Community Services has been dragging his feet in terms of adequately providing the kind of affordable, accessible housing that we need, like a wet shelter in this area, and really housing that will meet the needs of people. And so HRM becomes reluctant to enforce their own bylaws. And in some cases, HRM have very limited resources to go out and inspect these places so that, in fact, the bylaws can be enforced. But nevertheless, Mr. Speaker, we've just had a situation in my constituency where a rooming house on Cogswell Street was in fact shut down, and members here will be aware of that situation. And where did the people go? And what should have happened in that situation? You know, as soon as I heard that that rooming house had been shut down, I called the local councillor for the area, who told me that the Department of Community Services had been brought in to look at where these residents would be housed, and some of these folks have been sent to the emergency shelters and the Salvation Army and the Y, but only for a very limited period of time, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, you have to wonder, Mr. Speaker, why that was the case. I mean, here you had residents who had paid up their rent for the month to the landlord. There were still some days left in the month when the rooming house got shut down. If we were to amend the Residential Tenancies Act, as this resolution suggests, the obligation would be placed, the responsibility would be placed with the landlord to house tenants in this situation for the duration of the month in which their rent had been paid, and in addition to that for another 30 days. And at the end of that time, because generally landlords are told to live up to their obligations under the bylaws within 30 days, and sometimes if they are able to show progress but not complete the renovations, they're given another extension. So, Mr. Speaker, this would allow for tenants to be housed in alternate accommodation. The landlord would have the responsibility to provide for alternative accommodation. We wouldn't have the situation that we have with these folks, where they have been shuffled off to shelters and the kinds of arrangements that many of these residents don't really want to be gotten into, and perhaps they displace other people who need a bed in the shelter. And we would have an additional incentive to a landlord to adequately maintain their buildings and live up to the requirements that are placed on them under various fire and health and safety provisions at both a municipal and provincial level, Mr. Speaker. And this really is what I'm hoping to create some discussion and debate around. Mr. Speaker, I was very pleased after I tabled this resolution to hear the Minister of Justice interviewed on CBC one afternoon, where I believe he talked about that this was an idea with some merit. He indicated that he would have some concern about what about a landlord or a situation where the building was closed as the result of a fire, let's say outside the landlord's control. Let's say there was a grease fire that occurred in the unit of one of the tenants. Should the landlord be required in that case? This clearly is not what this resolution speaks to. This resolution is talking about when a building is closed because specifically the landlord has failed to maintain the property to minimum standards. This isn't rocket science. The standards are there. Everybody knows what those standards are. We have many officials that can assist the owners of residential properties. They know when they have to have smoke detectors. They know when they have to have entrances and exits and fire escapes and how they need to keep these things in good repair. They know about having windows that are fixed and not covered with plastic or some form of a tarp. They know these things. So, Mr. Speaker, I think that, you know, if we really had the political will, we could do something to assist the municipality of Halifax in terms of giving them more teeth and more resolve in terms of enforcing their bylaws to deal with the small number of slum landlords who are out there realizing a profit off the backs of vulnerable people who are living in poverty in our community. So thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the member opposite for her comments and for bringing this resolution forward. Before I get into my formal remarks, I want to provide a couple of opening remarks, specifically as it relates to HRM. Currently, HRM bylaw officers and building inspectors go out on a routine basis through the use and through the auspices of the Dangerous and Unsightly Premises Committee, receive complaints, investigate complaints, and bring them to that committee for council to deliberate over. As the first chair of the Halifax Regional Dangerous and Unsightly Premises Committee and a former chair, I want to say that the job of the bylaw officer and the building inspectors is a particularly difficult one. And my experience has been that in many cases the bylaw officers are very compassionate and reluctant to take action because they know often that the action that they're going to recommend to council is an action that would see that person or a group of persons or individuals left in a difficult situation. I know that in my experience, I've had the opportunity to work with many of these bylaw officers who take their job very seriously and have a great deal of compassion in the work they do. And I can point to individuals like Dave Bradshaw, who's been a bylaw officer and a building inspector with the City of Halifax and now HRM for a number of years, who is a very hard-working and dedicated civil servant who on a daily basis walks that delicate balance between protecting the interest of an individual and their health and safety and knowing very well that sometimes the recommendations that he brings forward will put them in another situation that they find untenable, and that is the situation where they're left with having to find new accommodations, often with very short notice, as is the case that has been brought forward in this resolution. And I too listened to a number of news articles, including an article where CBC had interviewed one of the tenants, and frankly, on behalf of the government, we feel that this person has been put in a difficult situation, not through his own fault. But we do have rules and laws in this province that are designed to help people in that circumstance, and the Residential Tenancy Act is one of those rules, one of those laws that will help resolve these issues. As I said earlier, I want to thank the member for raising the issue. It gives me an opportunity to explain how it is my department used the Residential Tenancy Act to resolve literally thousands of disputes each year between landlords and tenants. Now, the Residential Tenancy Act exists to provide landlords and tenants with an efficient and cost-effective means for settling disputes. Each and every year, our staff deal with over 50,000 inquiries and complaints and issues around tenancy matters, and they deal with it the same way I described my friend and the dedicated employee at HRM, Dave Bradshaw, deal with it often in a way that provides for a balance, and that is they understand the needs and the issues and the concerns of both tenants and landlords, and the fact that people need a place to live, and the fact they need to be treated fairly, and act as there to protect both the tenant and the landlord. Both tenants and landlords contact the Residential Tenancy Program to find out about their rights and help them resolve these problems. And often by the time they've contacted us, they've been in a dispute or have had an issue for an extended period of time. So our staff really are dealing with people who have been trying to deal with these matters on their own for an extended period of time. So therefore, it's already usually at a stage where it requires some delicate hands to deal with. When landlords and tenants can't find common ground on an issue, the Act provides for an effective dispute resolution process. Close to 5,000 disputes are brought to government's attention each year, and these are not the 50,000 inquiries that I talked about. These are the ones that have then moved on to that next stage where people have actually moved forward to the process where they've engaged the support of our staff at our Residential Tenancy Department to resolve this matter between themselves and their landlord, or vice versa. Out of these 5,000, about 1,000 of those disputes are mediated. They never get to a stage where they require any judicial input, where it's a matter of sitting down with the landlord and the tenant and resolving the issue on a face-to-face basis. This means that the parties are able to are helped by staff and find a solution that is acceptable to both sides. About 1,000 are withdrawn, usually because the parties have resolved the issues on their own, or one of the parties have realized that the issue is not sufficient to warrant moving forward to the next step. That leaves about 3,000 that are settled by bringing the parties together for a hearing, collecting evidence, testimony, and issuing a decision on the matter. Those 3,000 issues are the ones that some would describe as the most difficult ones to resolve, and often they are issues around the payment of rent, the provision of services to the tenant from the landlord, and matters like that. Now, the reason that I brought that background information to you, and the reason that it's important, is because it's relevant to the resolution. The Residential Tenancy Act is already structured to allow tenants to seek financial compensation when the landlord does not meet their obligations to them. And they can do that through any one of the processes that I've outlined in advance. They can do that through our mediation process, where we bring the sides together and try to resolve that. And they can also do that through a board process or a judicial process that allows for a hearing from both sides and then a resolution to the dispute. In extreme cases where premises become inhabitable, tenants have been awarded costs for moving, for temporary accommodation, and for loss of belongings, and so on. And that speaks directly to the therefore be it resolved clause. The member opposite brought to our attention the fact that tenants, that landlords be given, assume the financial responsibility for housing displaced tenants. And in fact, in Nova Scotia, there have been cases that have been brought to the residential tenancy process where landlords, because of the structure of the Act and because of the laws we have here in Nova Scotia, have been required to do just that. And so therefore, I think to some extent, this may be redundant. Maybe what it does speak, though, it speaks to the fact that maybe we need to do some more communication as it relates to this. And maybe what we need to do is provide tenants with an opportunity that might be a little easier to move and more expedient so that they can have these issues like this one resolved in a quick and painless manner. An important point to make is that the residential tenancy process is complaint-driven. It's up to the parties involved to bring their concerns to us and to let us know what remedy they're looking for. And in many cases, what we find is that the parties themselves aren't aware of the process and aren't aware of their rights within the Act. That speaks to what I spoke about just a few seconds ago, and it speaks to maybe some work that we as government might need to do, and that is to provide additional background information to tenants so that they're aware of their rights. And we try to do that as often as possible and in a way that it gets directly to tenants. And the one thing I will commit to the member opposite, to all members of this House, is that we will work, and I will work through our department, through our staff, to see if there's a way that we can provide for that tenants and landlords get as much information as possible so that they know that when they find themselves in a circumstance such as this, that there are remedies in the Act that will enable them to have a solution that is proposed in the therefore be it resolved. And we know that in Nova Scotia the Act has provided for those types of solutions. However, I want to say that it's not always clear whether the resolution means or suggests that a new process that operates outside of or beyond the current framework is necessary. And I don't believe that's necessary. I believe that if we use the existing Act, we apply the Act as it is written, we provide tenants and landlords with the information, and we provide a timely process so that they're able to move through this process in a quick way. And we do have occasions where we've been able to do that, we will be able to resolve these issues in a way that is expedient, understands the nature of the circumstance, particularly as it relates to this most recent one. Claims for compensation would need to be justified. Some oversight would be necessary. There is a lot of evidence to suggest that the current system already addresses these issues. But if the member opposite has suggestions on how we can work with the system that we have, 1 minute left, work with the system that we have so that we can make it better for tenants that find themselves in that extreme circumstance. And I do have a great deal of sympathy for the person that I heard on CBC Radio the other morning who found themselves in an extreme circumstance. Something happened, no fault of his own, that he did absolutely nothing wrong. He just happened to be somebody who was living in a property that the building inspector deemed not to be safe. The building inspector did nothing wrong. He was looking out for the health and safety of that individual. If there are ways that we can work within the current law and the current system to make it better, more reactive, to make it so that it addresses issues, I think that we should do that, and we can do that. I agree that the system is not perfect, but I would hope that landlords and tenants know that when they're in disputes, that we're here to help them, and that we will do what is necessary to resolve these disputes. Am I out of time, Mr. Speaker?
Please, yes, thank you. The Honourable Minister's time has expired. Thank you. The Honourable Member for Victoria Lakes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, it gives me great pleasure to speak on this resolution this evening. The member for Halifax Needham should be commended for bringing this resolution forward. And the issue has been brought forward after the incident on Cogswell Street where tenants were forced to vacate substandard premises. It's amazing that in this day and age that landlords are allowed to keep their buildings in deplorable condition, and some of them find a way to make that happen, Mr. Speaker. And it happens far too often with some residents. Luckily in the case, or in this case in particular, the landlord has been caught and will have to bring the building up to code. Unfortunately for the tenants, many have been forced to the street and forced to pay for accommodations for the second time. In an ideal world, a change to the Residential Tenancies Act would not be needed, but human nature being what it is, Mr. Speaker, there's always those that wish to operate outside of the law or vaguely within it. I think in this case, however, the House should adopt the resolution and work towards legislation that will protect displaced tenants. Mr. Speaker, there are other ways to bring about the same protection, but at the very least, the House could pass this resolution on for further discussion. The member has brought forth an issue which affects her constituents, but is also one that affects generally a lot of people who rent from one end of this province to the other. Members in this House are limited in their powers, but in this case, we may be able to effect some positive change, Mr. Speaker. I'm somewhat concerned that the government members couldn't see the merit in this resolution when the member asked for waiver. And just passing the resolution would not affect the law, but it could have forced the government to address this very serious issue. Any bill that could be presented to the House must have better language than is contained in this resolution. There has been some standard of proof that accommodations are substandard in the case on Cogswell Street. In this case, the building was deemed uninhabitable. Mr. Speaker, in this day and age, with rules and regulations and enforcements, as I said previously, there's always those who can seem to manipulate one way or the other and operate to the detriment, especially of these tenants. At the end of the day, however, Mr. Speaker, it's important that slum landlords are not able to exploit vulnerable tenants. Long before it gets to this date, landlords should be compelled to maintain their properties in accordance with municipal bylaws and provincial codes. Would these landlords live in similar or the same premises? I wonder. Maybe a good penalty would be to penalize the landlord and make them live on those premises for a week and see what it's like to live in deplorable conditions. And if there's deplorable conditions here in the summertime, how much greater are these conditions in the winter, when doors won't open properly, they won't close properly, and the snow is probably coming in under the doors. Mr. Speaker, this is an issue of enforcement and accountability. And sometimes I wonder, where is the enforcement and where is the accountability? Mr. Speaker, not all tenants are good tenants. Some play the system to the nth degree, the same as the landlords do. I've had about 2 years' experience as a tenancy officer, and it gave me an indication of both sides of the coin when making rulings. We shouldn't need laws to get people to do the right thing, but in this case, there is merit in bringing this forward. Mr. Speaker, I would therefore support the concept of this resolution and recommend that the government bring forth a plan to deal with the situations where people are forced on the street by the landlords who do not live up to their obligation. I've commended the Minister of Municipal Relations in the past for being proactive, and I hope he will adopt this resolution, Mr. Speaker. I will conclude my remarks by repeating a statement that I included in a letter to the Honourable Stéphane Dion when I wrote him a letter to work diligently to end the provincial park employees' strike. And I hope that this resonates for this government house, for all parties, and all members of Nova Scotia. Because my saying was, I said to him, I would like to feel proud that we do the right thing, and when we stand and sing, "O Canada, we stand on guard for thee." That should let all people know we represent everybody and we're willing to fight for their needs and wants. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Halifax Atlantic.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'd like to thank the Minister for Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations for his comments, although I wish that his comments had more closely addressed the situation that we are dealing with in the resolution brought to the floor here. This resolution actually pertains to a very real problem, and it pertains to a set of problems which are not really resolved after the fact in mediation or in dispute resolution of any kind or even in a court. The Residential Tenancies Act certainly does provide a tenant of any living space, rented accommodation, with the means to go to court and request financial compensation for things like finding lodging, moving, loss of belongings, all these things which may be the result of the landlord's failure to deliver what he has contracted to deliver. Unfortunately, it is not always enough to supply financial compensation after the fact. Not all of the people renting accommodations, renting roofs in our society are people who are primarily worried about the restoration of their belongings after they have lost their accommodations. There are people who are worried quite simply about nothing more than keeping a roof of any kind over their heads. And I can tell you from very personal experience that the worry, the fear of not having a roof over one's head is enough to leave a number of what we call the most vulnerable citizens of our society in a situation they are willing to stay in, no matter how much it may endanger their lives, rather than risk losing that last tenuous connection, A, with the civilized world, B, with their food and shelter allowance, and C, with warmth, if that may be the case. There are rental accommodations, Mr. Speaker, which can barely be described as accommodations, but there is certainly rent paid for them. And when it's discovered that those are barely accommodations, what is happening at this point is that people are being put out of them, because, quite rightly, because their lives are endangered. However, the landlord who has been collecting rent, the landlord has been collecting rent for the provision of accommodations, and accommodations of certainly very, very minimal standards. The landlord who has continued to collect rent is not obliged to provide new accommodation. And this, for a certain sector of our society, is not enough. I encounter people in my constituency, Mr. Speaker, quite regularly who have never contacted my office, who are not going to contact my office, who are not going to contact their municipal councillor, and who are most certainly not going to contact the Residential Tenancies Board. And yet, in conversation, it becomes apparent that they most certainly are in need of the help which ought to be provided by their government agencies, including their elected representatives, I should say. In conversation, one discovers that the wires are exposed and dangerous. In conversation, one discovers that there is not actually a roof on the shelter which has a roof. One discovers at times that an apartment is, in the springtime, an inch deep in water, and the rest of the year it is perhaps an eighth of an inch thick in mold as a result of the receding waters. But people do not want to report these things. And the reason they don't want to report these things is that, as I say, the good Residential Tenancies Board, quite rightly, and building inspectors, quite rightly, will insist that these quarters be closed down for repairs. The trouble is that when the quarters are closed, there's nowhere to go. And I can tell you too, Mr. Speaker, that the people with nowhere to go will turn to street corners, blankets, friends of friends of friends, who will offer a couch for a certain amount of money in addition to the rent already paid to the owner of the inadequate shelter, I might add. And they will engage in this phenomenon called couch surfing, something I had not heard of until recently. It's moving from couch to couch to couch, and I can tell you that the payment for that kind of accommodation is not something most would be able to recover in the Residential Tenancies Board. These people need roofs. They don't need the ability to go to court after the fact or to the Residential Tenancies Board after the fact and claim the money for the roof that they have tried to pay for twice. I can tell you again that it's another issue, but the shelter allowances provided by the Department of Community Services are barely adequate, and that is putting it politely, barely adequate to find any accommodation at all in this city, and it is not possible to pay twice in a given week or month for accommodation because the first one is gone. It is important that the Residential Tenancies Act be framed in such a way that it protects all tenants. Almost by definition, the people who are renting accommodations are people who have less equity, less security, less solidity in this world. Some have very little in the way of belongings, which they could mortgage, as we pawn, as the case may be. And you don't do that when you have received a notice of eviction 24 hours. You don't even get yourself to a pawn shop for the most part. The landlords of these quarters need to be held responsible for the completion of the contract that they sign, no matter how vulnerable and how unable to bring their case the other party to that contract may be. It is, in fact, our duty as a government to ensure that these contracts are fulfilled, and not fulfilled after the fact, not fulfilled with cash after the damage is done, but fulfilled simply by completion of the contract. Most landlords, I should say, are, I think, in the business because they are gaining some sort of income. This is, in some cases, a fairly large-scale commercial venture, and I think it is not too much to expect that if one is going to make money from this equipment, these apartments, rooms, whatever they may be, that some portion of that money should in fact be held in reserve for provision against damage, provision against failure of equipment. You don't go out, I can tell you, you do not buy, I can give an example, you don't buy a web for a pulp mill and risk that there won't be a backup if that thing breaks. That's a very expensive piece of equipment. Its failure is a very, very expensive phenomenon, and so you provide against it. But if that roof, if that apartment is in fact vulnerable to fire, flood, and other life-endangering circumstances, and it is decided that therefore that equipment has failed, why is it that because the stakes are low, it's all right just to leave it, not to have any kind of a backup provision? I would have to say, Mr. Speaker, human lives don't have backup. And we really do need to be recognizing that fact. It is not too much to ask the owners of commercial premises to provide backup. More communication, mediation, dispute resolution. What is the cost of supervising and overseeing claims for compensation for loss of goods? This is an administrative cost, the provision of an overseer, a supervisor, someone who will ensure that there's not too much cash paid out. On the other hand, who will ensure that enough is paid out? Who will ensure that for these people who do not have reserves of cash, that there is in fact, at the very least, a reserve of shelter? These are basic human needs that we are dealing with. And I hope, Mr. Speaker, that this minor provision, which would say owning and taking money for the provision of accommodations, entails the responsibility to complete that contract, isn't too heavy a demand to place on the landlords who own these premises. With that, Mr. Speaker, I will conclude, and once again, I hope very, very strongly that this resolution will be passed and that tenants who find themselves, through no fault of their own, without acceptable shelter are in fact provided with something in the interim. Thank you very much.
Fellow Minister of Community Services.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I want to thank the honourable members who have spoke
previously to this issue for their input. I want to thank the official opposition for bringing it up, and I want to share a few of my observations as the minister responsible for housing services in this province, because this was, I believe, triggered by the city's building inspector going and finding the conditions of rooming house in Cogswell Street not to meet the health and safety standards, the minimum standards that are put in place by HRM. And this is something which is a perplexing issue, as my colleague, the Minister of Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations, spoke to in his time as a municipal councillor. And I, too, experienced a little bit of that Hobson's choice, I suppose you would put it, when earlier this year I was taking a tour of some of the facilities in the North End. I met quite a number of people. I saw some of these rooming houses, but more importantly, I had a chance to meet some of the people that live in them, and some of the people that do not have the benefit of having an address as well, those that live in places like the Salvation Army and Metro Turning Point, at least on a temporary basis until they can get some other sort of accommodation. To say that there was one incident on this particular day that stood out above and beyond the rest of them, I'm not sure would be a fair statement. There were a number of impressions that I've been left with and I will carry with me for the rest of my life as a result of this particular day I spent on Gottingen Street and in the surrounding area. And I'm going to refer to the person that made the impression that would best describe the challenge that's faced here as Holly. Holly is not her real name, but I was down at a drop-in center on Gottingen Street where people come to get camaraderie, get some shelter. When it's February, you'd like to have some warmth. I met a lot of interesting people there. But Holly was one that was particularly upset. And she came to me, and her eyes were dilated. And I had no idea of her age, but I understand afterwards that she was in her 30s. Not in particularly good health, I would suggest. And she was upset. But she wasn't sure what she was most upset about. First of all, she spoke about the conditions in her home, which was a rooming house, that the vermin would run over her sleeping bag, they'd defecate on it, they'd eat her food. It was not a particularly pleasant description of what she had to look forward to at the end of the day. And I'm sure that runs contrary to the municipal bylaws. And after Holly had rather compassionately expressed how she had to live and how it upset her, then she got more upset again because the city had been by. They had inspected her premises, the landlord's premises. There were 4 units there. Found them to be wanting and ordered and issued an order which was going to evict her in a week's time in the middle of winter. So she wasn't sure whether she should be more upset about the conditions that she was forced to live in or the fact that she was not going to have a home anymore. Now, with regards to that, I do want to make it absolutely clear that there is provision with places like Metro Turning Point for men and the YWCA for women, where they can go for a short period of time. It's not what I describe as a home. It's not where I think anybody would necessarily choose to be, but it does give them an option other than being out in the cold in the street. And that's very important, I think, to all of us to know that that's the case. But it did shed in Technicolor the dilemma that the Minister of Service Nova Scotia and Municipal Relations spoke to in his role as chair of that committee on HRM. And what is the right answer, Mr. Speaker? You know, well, I think the right answer is that we've got to get in there and we've got to assist these people to improve the rooming houses, and that is why, as I was referring to yesterday in the late night debate about the importance of the rental preservation program, which is going to commit money for that very purpose. And I'm getting a nod. I gather my time is up. I thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Time allotted for this resolution has expired as well. I think that's the end of opposition members' business. The honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That concludes our business for today, and I'll call on the Government House Leader for the hours for tomorrow.
Mr. Speaker, the House will meet on the morrow at the hour of 12 noon and sit until 8 p.m. The order of business will be public bills for second reading, and we may do some private members' public bills on the order paper if time permits.
Motion is the House adjourned to 12 noon tomorrow. Is it agreed? All those in favour say aye. Contrary-minded, nay. The motion is carried. We've reached the moment of interruption. Call upon the honourable member for Kings North.
Much, Mr. Speaker. It's a pleasure to be here to speak on the resolution that elected Senate would better be able to represent the interests of the province of Nova Scotia. One of my colleagues joked to me that during the debate I'd feel like I was in the Senate, where pictures of old politicians stare down at empty seats while a few people listen to what has to be said. But in spite of that, I think it's an important issue and one that I'm grateful to have the opportunity to talk on. I have to admit to a bit of a frustration in the format of how we do the debates in the House. The traditional debating format, there's a chance for rebuttal to the first speaker, but in this case there isn't. And so I'm going to try and anticipate in my comments some of the objections that might be made to an elected Senate. And I think there's basically two. The first is, why is this issue being raised in a provincial legislature when really it's a federal matter? And the second objection is that the Senate really should be abolished rather than reformed. And those, I think, are the two main objections that will come from the speakers after me to this issue. Let me respond to the first objection then. The purpose of the Senate when it was first formed, Mr. Speaker, was to provide a school of sober second thought, and it was, secondly, to represent the interests of the regions and the provinces that make up this great country of Canada and that made it up at that stage. And since Nova Scotians are a very important part of a very important province within this country and part of a very distinctive region, the Maritime and Atlantic region, and, Mr. Speaker, since historically it was delegates from Nova Scotia and from this area that pushed for a Senate in order to protect the regional interests of the country, that therefore it does make great sense that we debate this issue in a provincial legislature, because we have a vested interest in a Senate. We have a vested interest in the Senate working well. The second response, the second objection is perhaps a more substantive one nowadays, and that's the one I want to respond to more fully. And that is the fact that the Senate is beyond any hope of reformation. It's an archaic institution from the past, and it should simply be abolished, and there should be no talk of reforming the Senate. And I know that colleagues in my own caucus, somewhat misinformed perhaps, but nonetheless sincere in their beliefs, hold this view. It's not one that I hold, and I'll explain why. The problem is not with the Senate, Mr. Speaker. The problem is that the Senate has become a chamber of patronage by the Prime Minister, where cronies are put rather than a place where people who can represent well and fully the regions that they come from may be active on behalf of those regions, on behalf of those provinces. The latest example is well documented in the minds of Nova Scotians. The appointment by Prime Minister Jean Chrétien in the dying days of his reign as Prime Minister, of his friend Terry Mercer, who perhaps may have been born in Nova Scotia but hasn't set foot in this, hasn't lived in this province for the last 20 years and hasn't been active, to my knowledge, representing the interests of Nova Scotians. That's just one example. There are more egregious examples of senators that will come to mind which spark these calls for the abolishment of the Senate. But really, I think the sentiment that the Senate is not working should give call for the reformation of the Senate rather than for its abolishment, because the Senate can still play, if we have an elected Senate, the very important role of representing the interests of the various regions across this great federation of Canada. And that was one of the original reasons it was set up for, Mr. Speaker. It was set up, as I said, a school of sober second thought. One doesn't see that function being as necessary anymore with the diversity of political parties that we have in the House of Commons, although one could imagine a time when you had one party dominating the House of Commons, such you've had in the legislatures of Prince Edward Island, for example, where you did need the balance of an elected Senate in order to slow down what might be hasty and ill-thought-out legislation. Although nowadays, with the multiplicity of parties, I don't see that function as being as important. But I do